Chapter 223. Next to the bonfire under the moonlight, the brown-haired woman wiped the long sword in her hand and looked in the direction of Luo Yu's carriage with vigilance. In the entire camp, 5 night watchers were in different directions, and the curse vessel had been activated. Of course, in order not to disturb the Son of God, Cynthia did not include Luo Yu's carriage in the scope of the curse vessel, but it should be enough. In theory, all of Shi Yu's curses needed a medium to carry them. These mediums could be water, fire, or earth. Even the most illusory curse needed to be transported by curse power. The only thing that could barely escape this theory was the rare space curse, but the distance was the biggest limitation. As for Luo Yu's carriage, it was impossible to invade with space curse. Seraphia had produced the gemstone necklace fleet, so they were very familiar with space curse. Luo Yu's carriage itself was set up with a barrier. Not to mention others, even Xia Luo's space bomb couldn't jump in. Therefore, after confirming that there was no abnormality on the ground and in the sky, as long as Cynthia guarded the door, Luo Yu should be safe. At least, that was what the serious and responsible captain thought. However, she didn't know that some extremely special bloodlines could use natural phenomena that were not caused by the person as a medium. For example, moonlight. Inside the carriage, the silver-haired girl gently stretched out her fingertips, and a faint light began to spread and floated in the carriage. The sleeping curse was like a lullaby, making the boy sleep deeper. After confirming that everything was going smoothly, AI Lizzie was completely relieved. Now, Luo Yu's parking location was not far from Rosetta City, but it was also very close to Akot Hill. AI Lizzie had to follow for a few more days before showing up to avoid being sent back by her brother. Since Luo Yu coughed up blood because of AI Lizzie's anger, the girl was very afraid of Luo Yu's anger. However, as a sister who grew up with Luo Yu, AI Lizzie knew Luo Yu too well. As long as the journey was far, her brother would definitely not let her go home and would definitely take her with him. As long as it was an established fact, what was done could not be undone. With Luo Yu's spoiling of her, the boy could only sleep with her in the end. AI Lizzie was very clear about this matter. Brother is really cute when he's asleep. Thinking so, AI Lizzie's cheeks gradually began to redden. Luo Yu usually had to maintain his dignity as the acting lord, so that people would not subconsciously look down on him due to his age. But when he was sleeping, the completely relaxed boy's cheeks would soften a lot. This was also one of the reasons why AI Lizzie secretly came to see Luo Yu at night. Feeling the warm breath, AI Lizzie felt that her emotions were gradually getting out of control. Under the moonlight, the girl leaned down and kissed the boy lightly, but this was not enough to satisfy her. AI Lizzie's curses were actually similar to sleeping pills. It could cause people to enter a deep sleep, but sleeping did not mean that they would not be woken up. Overly intense movements could also cause them to wake up, so the girl's kisses could only wander around the lips and not go deeper. AI Lizzie's eyes were in a daze, but at least she knew that she could not expose herself, so she could only kiss from the lips all the way to the neck. But this not only did not relieve the burning in her body, but it also made the heat even more intense. AI Lizzie moaned and could not help but want to do something else. But at the crucial moment, Luo Yu's unconscious groan gave her a fright. AI Lizzie heard Luo Yu's groan and immediately straightened her body. But the black-haired boy only adjusted his posture and fell silent again. The girl who had a false alarm heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, her mind became much clearer. She panted heavily to calm her breathing and reached out to touch her abdomen. After thinking for a moment, she shook her head slightly. No, it's still too early. The baby won't be born. As the young girl muttered to herself, she bit her lower lip, unwilling to give up. In Shia, the physiological education of the nobles was relatively complete. In order to prevent children who did not know how to behave, the young ladies would be forced to attend physiological classes after their first menstrual period, and the consequences of tasting the forbidden fruit too early would be clearly explained. AI Lizzie listened to Anna's classes and heard about the risks and dangers of premature birth due to the immature pelvic bones. Only then did she suppress her restless heart. It had to be said that Anna's classes were very pertinent. In this aspect, no matter how much the maids supported their young mistress, they did not dare to joke about it. In fact, the highest mortality rate for noble ladies was childbirth. Even low-level extraordinaires could have accidents. Of course, because of her bloodline, AI Lizzie did not need to worry at all in this aspect. She was immortal under the moon and could even skip the problem of her pelvic bones and undergo a cesarean section. But there was another problem, and that was that such an unnatural child would not be able to receive Shiya's blessing. This was a major disadvantage among the nobles. AI Lizzie naturally did not want the child of her and Luo Ya's love to suffer such grievances, so she could only grit her teeth and wait until she reached adulthood. Thinking of this, the silver-haired girl calmed down a lot. She looked around and shook her head awkwardly. Without a doubt, AI Lizzie was also dissatisfied with the environment here for her first time. Although the carriage prepared by Sorophia had a different kind of excitement, it made AI Lizzie feel that it was very informal, and she had the illusion that she was a third party. If she really wanted to be intimate with her dear elder brother, it would have to be at Akkad's house, their love nest in the mansion. It would not be good to be in the wilderness. AI Lizzie dismissed the idea and lay down gently beside the boy. She looked at Luo Ya's cheek and closed her eyes. Let's leave it at that for tonight. The next morning, Luo Ya's carriage set off at dawn. The boy, who had not woken up so early in a long time, was surprised to find that he was in good spirits. After thinking for a while, Luo Ya could only attribute it to the good quality of sleep last night. Although they were in the wilderness, the natural scenery did seem to be good for sleeping. But for some reason, Luo Ya's lips felt a little awkward. What's the matter? Can camping in the wilderness hurt one's lips? Luo Ya was a little confused about this matter, but she soon forgot about it. After all, it was just a small matter. Perhaps she just bumped her teeth when she turned over at night. Otherwise, there was no other explanation. Chapter 224. St. Freya Academy was an academic institution with hundreds of years of history. It was also the core area of the entire country of scholars, Bucharest. The word Freya originated from Freya in the ancient Austinian language. Freya was the god of knowledge and truth. He had a wide range of beliefs in ancient Austinian. Legend had it that one of the three major source substances of mankind, wisdom, originated from him. In the Second Era, there was even a statue of this god at the entrance of the academy. At that time, Freya was said to be a dignified man. But just like in Luo Ya's previous life, Guanyin Bodhisattva changed from a man to a woman in the process of spreading religion. A god that no one had ever seen before was also a problem in Shiya, a world where information transmission was underdeveloped. Especially from the end of the Second Era to the beginning of the Third Era, too much culture was lost, and a lot of content was changed. On the other hand, whether or not gods had a gender had also caused a great deal of discussion in the academic community in the early Third Era. Although this question was useless from Luo Ya's point of view, it was very important for many believers of that era. So after a long period of tearing each other apart, the old man, Freya, was swept into the trash heap of history and turned into Freya, the goddess of knowledge and truth. At least, this was what the country of scholars thought. Luo Ya seriously suspected that this group of scholars had been single for too long and did not want to see a man even when they were worshipping a god. But he had to admit that the country of scholars had put in a lot of effort to build this academy that had the name of the god of knowledge and truth as its signboard. St. Freya Academy was the best choice for the nobles in Shiya to graduate from. It was also the top of the entire academy's chain of contempt. It could be said to overlook the world. To some extent, it was similar to the Tokyo University of Japan in Luo Ya's previous life. Almost all the upper-class nobles graduated from this academy, such as Luo Ya's father, Kadia. As a place where talents gathered, St. Freya Academy was also the initial stage for Recorder's Eye. To this day, Luo Ya's flag-raising journey could be said to be quite successful. Akate territory was thriving under his leadership. Ai Lizzie, Nuo Iyer, and Xia Luot were all raised by him one after another. Especially Xia Luot, it could be said that it was completely unexpected. Luo Ya originally just wanted to raise some favorability, but in the end, it unexpectedly progressed to this extent. Now that 3 of the 4 heroines were gone, the lineup that besieged Luo Ya to death in the game could be said to have completely collapsed. However, Luoya had to admit that he was not completely at ease. If Nuo was the one with the strongest attack power among the heroines, Ai Lizzie was the one with the strongest performance in that plot. Xiaoluo was the one with the least impact, and she was the one who supported Luoya. Then the last heroine, Lillian Aikman, was the most troublesome one. Yes, the current princess of the Austin Empire was the last person who besieged Luoya to death in Recorder's Eye. Luoya didn't know much about this person, even less than Xiaoluo. However, there was one thing that firmly attracted the attention of all the players at that time, and that was her identity. Lillian Aikman was nominally the elder sister of Paul Aikman, who was an illegitimate child. The two were directly related by blood. Normally, this kind of character could not be used as a heroine. After all, if it was true, then it would be a German orthopedic plot, but it did not seem to be the case. These two people were actually not of the same bloodline, and the problem should be with Paul. It was obvious that as the daughter of the Austin Empire's emperor, Lillian's identity could not be faked. After all, it was too difficult to be the Green Empire's emperor, Lucas Aikman. The Austin people were not idiots. As a big country with the abnormal ideology of the pureblood faction, they had always valued bloodline. It was impossible for them to let this happen. In fact, when the prince and princess were born, it was necessary to walk in front of the curse vessel that could detect the bloodline. After growing up, there were also many treasures that needed to be activated by the royal bloodline. Lillian had lived in the Austin Empire for more than 10 years, so there was no possibility of faking it. If it was possible, it could only be Paul who was suddenly found among the people. He had only stayed in the Austin Empire for a short time before he was sent to the academy in Bologna, the country of scholars. Only his experience could avoid the layers of screening. But if Paul was a fake Austin royal bloodline, there was something wrong with the plot. So for Luoya, who basically only remembered the common plot, this matter was a bit confusing. Many hidden secrets were probably only revealed in the Lillian plot, but these were not important to him. What he cared about was another point. That was Lillian Aikman. For some reason, she was very hostile to Luoya in the plot. Not after Luoya revealed his identity as a cultist, but at the beginning. For this reason, Luoya was still very confused. He could only attribute it to Lillian's innate intelligence. She keenly discovered Luoya's abnormality in the plot and had doubts but no evidence, so she took countermeasures. From this point of view, Luoya's current situation was still very optimistic. After all, joining a cultist was already impossible for Luoya, who had awakened his bloodline. So, isn't the situation looking good for us? After thinking for a long time, Luoya blinked and suddenly felt that his future seemed to be bright. In this case, it would be fine even if he didn't pull out Lillian's flag. Thinking about it, how could there be so many people who were prejudiced against him? After all, Xiaoluo's situation was in the minority, and the probability was so small that it could be ignored. The Austin Empire where Lillian was from was thousands of miles away from him, so how could it have anything to do with him? Sigh, I'm overthinking it. The black-haired young man thought so and heaved a sigh of relief. He smiled at his beautiful future. As expected of me, I've completed all my goals before entering the academy. Thinking so, Luoya stood up, picked up the teacup on the table, and elegantly and calmly took a sip of tea. Although his side's victory was already certain, he still had to be careful with his own life. Besides, the academy wasn't just a matter of Luoya's fate. There were more realistic situations, such as finding the scholar. After confirming his goal, Luoya put down the teacup and looked out the window at the mercenaries who were in a strict formation. Then, he looked at the empty carriage that didn't even have a maid. For a moment, he couldn't get used to it. Is this a solo trip? Life is as lonely as snow. As the young man said so, he reached out and rubbed his still awkward lips. Chapter 225. It had been 3 days since he left Luosai City, and Luoya felt that there was something wrong with his journey. Why is my mouth a little swollen? Looking at his bright red lips in the mirror, Luoya's head was full of question marks, and his eyes revealed a deep sense of confusion. Although before the start of this journey, Luoya had thought about the possibility of diseases such as acclimatization, he had to admit that the current situation was a little beyond his understanding. Swollen mouth, what kind of disease could this be? Could it be that eating too much roasted meat made him heady? No, it didn't happen before. After all, how could an extraordinaire's body be so weak? Luoya couldn't figure out what was wrong with himself, so he could only call Cynthia over and ask if this was a common disease during the journey. Cynthia looked at him, and her expression was a little awkward. "My lord, your mouth seems to be a little swollen." Cynthia carefully observed for a long time and said so. Luoya couldn't help but be a little speechless. He could only hold his chin and look at the ground, thinking about the reason. However, it was this action that made the young man's dilated pupils suddenly focus, and he stared at the ground like needles. This time, when Seraphia modified the carriage, she took into account the possibility of a battle, so the interior of the carriage didn't use a soft carpet that could make one unstable. Instead, she used a special floor that could increase one's grip on the ground. Because of this, some things that normally wouldn't be left behind on the carriage were clearly visible, such as footprints. The black-haired young man stared at the faint footprints on the ground, and his expression gradually became unsightly. It wasn't that no one entered Luoya's carriage, or rather, it was to report to him about the daily itinerary and route. Cynthia and the others entered many times, but Luoya could be sure that these footprints didn't belong to any of the guards, because the footprints were too small, and it even made him suspect that they belonged to a child. A child, in the middle of the night when he was asleep, entered his carriage surrounded by guards? Thinking of this possibility, Luoya's hair stood on end. Although ghosts did exist in Shiya's world and there were many ways to get rid of them, the horror of someone staring at him at night still made him feel very uncomfortable. On the other hand, the thing that could leave behind footprints was probably not a ghost, but something more advanced. The most common legend was that there were banshees in the forest that sucked the lives of travelers, but these records were from hundreds of years ago. Luoya didn't believe that he could encounter such a thing like winning the lottery, but even if it was a human, the nature of this matter was very serious. The carriage of the Akkad family's heir wasn't a public transport. Not everyone could get on it. After thinking for a while, the black-haired young man calmed down and called out to Cynthia with his usual tone. "Cynthia, give me the map." "Yes, sir." The brown-haired woman took the map and entered the carriage, but what she saw was Luoya's serious face. The young man gently pointed to the ground, and Cynthia's face immediately turned gloomy. Half an hour later, the young lady walked out of the carriage and continued to move forward without saying a word, as if nothing had happened. Luoya was also as usual, and even took an afternoon nap. In the evening, the convoy stopped by the roadside again. After a little hunting to replenish their rations, the convoy had dinner. Luoya, who seemed to be in a good mood, even sang a song with his subordinates. After that, the black-haired young man returned to the carriage to sleep at about the same time as a few days ago. Time passed little by little, and when the silver moon hung high in the sky at midnight, Luoya's sleeping carriage lit up with a faint silver light, and a slender figure appeared as expected. The next moment, the young man exploded, and the sound of fighting filled the air. Half an hour later, in the carriage, Luoya sat at the table and stared expressionlessly at the seductress who broke into his carriage. On the bed opposite, the pitiful young lady was sitting like a duck facing her elder brother, blushing and lowering her head without saying a word. It has to be said that Luoya and Cynthia's plan to lure the enemy was very successful. At midnight, Ai Lizzie, who was in a good mood after hearing Luoya's song, appeared without any warning. However, what welcomed her was a huge bone claw and surrounded from all sides. The moment he saw Ai Lizzie's face, Luoya's actions stopped reflexively, but it was too late to stop his subordinates outside the carriage. As the leader of the Iron Wall mercenaries, Cynthia placed great importance on this journey of escorting her family's saint. She never thought that even with all her precautions, there would still be a problem. In order to make up for her mistake, Cynthia rushed in fiercely, and almost at the same time when Luoya stopped, she broke in with her men. Then, it was the public execution. Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the silver-haired young lady was frozen in her position of taking off her shoes and climbing onto her elder brother's bed. The black-haired young man was also stunned, and the same went for Cynthia. The leader of the mercenaries had escorted Xia Luo before, so naturally she had seen the eldest daughter of the Akkad family. However, while Luoya and Cynthia had seen each other before, the rest of the mercenaries did not recognize her. Chapter 226. Under the moonlight, Cynthia looked at the nearby guards and used her eyes to signal them not to make any noise. And in the carriage in the middle of the crowd, the silver-haired girl was silent under Luoya's gaze. Luoya had seen a lot of night raids in movies in his previous life. As one of the sources of joy, the young man was quite happy to see it. Of course, that was if it didn't happen to him. But in Shiya, this was the first time Luoya heard of such a thing. The reason was none other than their identity. Luoya was the only son of the Akkad family. Every day, there would be someone on duty outside the room where he slept. There were also maids at the door waiting to be summoned. Physically speaking, a night raid was impossible. Moreover, the girls that Luoya saw were not ordinary. If they weren't the daughters of famous families, then they were the daughters of noble families. Nobles were very particular about elegance. Even in ancient times, nobles had a fixed size in their bedrooms because they had to maintain their elegance at all times. Although this kind of absurd behavior had been eliminated in this era, nobles still had to be reserved. A night raid was simply inconceivable, not to mention a woman attacking a man in the middle of the night. Moreover, they were siblings. Without a doubt, if this matter were to spread, it would be a huge blow to AI Lizi's reputation. This was also something that Luoya had a headache, but also something to be thankful about. Fortunately, the guards this time were from the unyielding perseverance sect. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. Tell me, what do you think? Because I don't want to be separated from Big Brother. So, as soon as Luoya's question came out, the silver-haired girl's face immediately fell and she pitifully bit her lips. But Anna is handling the Akkad family's matters very well. I can't do anything at home, so I might as well accompany Big Brother. Accompany me? Is accompanying me the same as sneaking into the carriage in the middle of the night? Do you know what people will think if they see this? Under the angry questioning of the black-haired youth, AI Lizi's eyes became wet and she began to sob uncontrollably. Ever since they were young, Luoya had always doted on AI Lizi, and the number of times he had reprimanded her could be counted on one hand. Now that he was really angry, the young girl was almost defenseless and immediately burst into tears. Looking at this AI Lizi, Luoya felt a headache coming on. He had no choice but to swallow his words. He sighed and softened his tone. Sigh, do you know that if this matter gets out, you won't be able to get married in the future? Sob, I'm sorry, AI Lizi, who wanted to apologize out of reflex, was stunned. She suddenly stopped crying and blinked her eyes. Not being able to get married. Was there such a good thing? AI Lizi stared blankly for a moment like a blind monk who had discovered a dot. Luoya, who had discovered that the girl's power had suddenly been cut off, was also puzzled. AI Lizi? Sob, I'm sorry. The girl hurriedly continued to cry and apologize under Luoya's strange gaze. But the eyes behind her hands lit up. Big Brother, Sob, will AI Lizi really not be able to get married if I do this? This depends on the situation. The guards this time are my people, so they shouldn't be able to spread the news. Sob, if AI Lizi can't get married, will Big Brother take responsibility? What are you saying? If you can't get married, then so be it. I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. Hearing the silver-haired girl's sobbing pleas, Luoya immediately patted his chest. However, the youth didn't know that AI Lizi's breathing suddenly sped up when she heard this, as if she had grasped the marriage code. So that's how it is. In other words, as long as this matter gets out, or the night attack in the future gets out. AI Lizi's eyes flickered as she maintained her crying appearance. Seeing this, Luoya didn't feel that anything was wrong, so he didn't reprimand her anymore. When it came to education, it was enough for the child to admit her mistakes from the bottom of her heart. Endlessly reprimanding to vent one's emotions would be as bad as not doing enough. Moreover, Luoya's identity could only be considered as half apparent. After understanding all this, the black-haired youth changed the topic and carefully asked about AI Lizi's life over the past few days. In the end, he realized that the silver-haired girl wasn't that ridiculous. In fact, AI Lizzie was in a hurry to leave the city not only to hide from Luoya, but also to speed up and catch up to Kadia. The girl actually obtained permission from Luoya's father, but what the guards and Kadia didn't know was that AI Lizzie, who had found Luoya, didn't actually show herself, but followed him all the way to the middle of the night to steal food. Chapter 227. Half a month later, on the official road of the Austin Empire's town of Baudry, a caravan entered the town in an orderly fashion. It was a caravan of around 30 people and several carriages. There were no family emblems on the carriages, but they had the common symbol of Lo Chase side. This meant that the caravan didn't belong to a noble family, but was under the banner of one of Lo Chase's many merchant guilds. Without a noble background, they naturally wouldn't alarm any local nobles. But for a remote mountain village like Baudry, the arrival of a caravan was something new and attracted the attention of the townspeople. It had to be said that this time's gathering was very rewarding. For example, they saw a pair of beautiful children who looked like they'd walked out of a painting. They were a black-haired youth and a silver-haired girl in the middle carriage of the caravan. The two of them were in the same carriage and seemed to be a young fiancé. If you asked why they were husband and wife, the first reason was naturally because they were in the same carriage. The second reason was that although the two of them were very beautiful, the color of their hair and eyes was too different. As for the third reason, it was that the two of them were very affectionate. Every time they appeared, the black-haired youth and the silver-haired girl would stick together, either hugging or holding hands. The expression on the youth's face was fine, while the girl had a happy smile. The married women of the town were all too familiar with this expression. They were completely immersed in love, so all kinds of guesses arose. Among them, the rumor that the young master of a merchant guild had brought his fiancée on a pre-wedding trip was the most colorful. Luoya didn't know about these things, and was used to AI Lizzie hugging and hugging since childhood. Even if he knew that he was being misunderstood, he couldn't be bothered to explain, even if he knew that AI Lizzie was always acting intimately in front of outsiders. All of Elise's mistakes can be forgiven. This is Rojas' theorem, and so far it hasn't been broken. The boy's love for the silver-haired girl is real. Even if she made a mistake, it's still the same. Luoya attributed the girl's muddle-headed night attack at the beginning of the journey as a prank. Cynthia and the others didn't dare to raise any objections, but there was no doubt that those who had seen AI Lizzie crawl into bed didn't believe it. Faced with this situation, Luoya had no choice but to strictly order everyone not to spread the news. However, AI Lizzie, who wanted the whole world to know about the night attack so that she wouldn't be able to get married, was very dissatisfied with this order. She could only reveal to Cynthia and the others that the two of them were actually foster siblings. When Cynthia found out that Luoya was not related to AI Lizzie by blood, she heaved a sigh of relief. She was glad that her holy son did not violate ethics and was an ordinary person with common sense. But then, the way she looked at AI Lizzie changed. That was the way he looked at his mistress. After all, from Cynthia's point of view, the two of them had already shared the same bed. Wasn't their future marriage already set in stone? However, what she didn't know was that Luoya's bed was comparable to the city walls of Russia during the 100 Years' War. As the saying went, the flag on the city wall changed. AI Lizzie's army only had the upper hand for a while, but this didn't hinder Cynthia and AI Lizzie's relationship by leaps and bounds. After finding out that the two of them weren't related by blood, the Perseverance Church also chose to side with the siblings during their daily public displays of affection. The Holy Son and Miss AI Lizzie's relationship today was also very good. Cynthia ordered her subordinates to carry the wine while looking in the direction of the carriage with a warm smile. On the carriage, Luoya was currently staring at the cup in his hand and swirling it around. After entering the town, Luoya ordered his subordinates to collect the scattered cade wine in the shops and even the houses of the residents. As for himself, he directly went to the town's best tavern to buy a cup. Regarding this wine that had a history of more than 1,000 years, Luoya, as a historian, was actually quite interested in it. It had to be said that it was really cheap, 2 copper coins for a cup, and there was also a piece of sweet lime in it. According to the tavern owner, it was too bitter, and some people couldn't drink it if they didn't put it in. Luoya heard this and tasted it on the spot, but he almost spat it out. Due to the brewing process, the alcohol content of Cade wine wasn't high. Perhaps it was because of the mushrooms, but it had a valiant and numbing taste. However, the taste was really bad. Bitter, it was quite bitter, and there was a faint smell of the earth. Compared to the specialty wine of Akot Hill, it was completely opposite. Because it was too disgusting, Luoya didn't bring a cup for Ai Lizzie. When he returned, the girl's reaction after tasting it proved that Luoya's behavior was correct. It was obvious that the local specialty didn't satisfy Luoya, but for Luoya, who had personally come to the Austin Empire for the first time, there was more to observe. As a lord, it was necessary to visit foreign cities and learn from advanced experiences. After a series of observations, Luoya discovered that the Austin Empire wasn't as rich and powerful as he imagined. At the very least, the construction of the mountain towns was very poor, and even fell behind the southern mountains of Akot Hill that Luoya had ruled for a few years. Moreover, the residents' sense of belonging to the Austin Empire was also very poor. The term pure-blood faction didn't have any roots here, so the inexplicable sense of superiority naturally didn't exist. This made Luoya feel very comfortable. Thinking about it, when one didn't even have enough food and clothing, who would care about the bloodline of the kingdom? It was just a bubble when one fainted from hunger. After a day of observation, Luoya once again confirmed the core idea of Akot Hill's economic development as the core. After selling some daily necessities, replenishing food, and collecting more than 20 barrels of Cade wine, Luoya's group also completed their mission here. After a rare night of rest in the hotel, they embarked on the journey to Sharon Forest early the next morning. In the forest, a middle-aged man with brown hair and a gray-haired old man were moving forward in a chaotic forest. The middle-aged man was called Rodney, and the old man was called Wood. Both of them were village chiefs and part-time leaders of the pagan power sect. As the village chief and the leader of a sect, they undoubtedly had a good status, but now their appearance could only be described as embarrassing. Rodney was still young compared to Wood. He had strong firepower when he fought, so the clothes on his body were particularly tattered. The stick could be used as a mop. The gray-haired old man's situation was better. His body was wrapped in a wolf skin jacket, but most of the fur had fallen off. When the wind blew, it didn't move, so it was bald like a leather jacket. Obviously, the two people's dressing was very unsuitable for their identity. As for why, it was a long story. Since the village of the power sect had been targeted by the cultists because of the scale of the snake god, it had been 3 years. In 3 years, Rodney and others had moved home twice. They were forced to cross the mountains and escape to the Sharon Forest where people rarely went. At the same time, the whole village activated spirit vision to look for clues about the god and the Son of God. Chapter 228. Early in the morning, the sun rose. Sharon Forest, which was slightly dark due to the cover of the leaves, had a new day of recovery. Diurnal animals began to come out of their nests, and the chirping of birds echoed in the forest. However, in this refreshing weather, a team of about 100 people silently walked through the forest. They were dressed in simple clothes, and many of them didn't even have shoes. The leaders were a middle-aged man with dark brown hair and a gray-haired old man. They were Rodney and Wood. At this moment, the two of them were holding weapons and looking for a good position in the forest to ambush the villagers who were hiding on both sides of the road. That's right, today, the two village chiefs, the leader of the power sect, and an expert of source level 3 would turn into robbers and play the game of, I opened this mountain and planted this tree. Regarding this point, the two people who had never robbed in their lives felt very embarrassed, but they couldn't do anything about it because this was the request of the Lord of the Forest. This was the first time Rodney and Wood, who had lived here for more than 2 years, heard of the request of the Lord of the Forest. After all, as a Tyrant who had survived from ancient times, Cade didn't have most of the needs of humans. What in the world made the sage of the forest ask for help from them? Could it be that there was a big crisis here? The two people who thought so had a serious attitude, but after hearing Cade's words, their expressions became strange. I heard the news from my companions from afar. A team has brought a lot of wine here, and it's my favorite cutty wine. Oh, that eternal delicacy. I haven't had it for almost 100 years. That night, Rodney and Wood looked at each other and listened to the tall Ent sigh for an hour. The content of the sigh was no different from that of an old drunkard's father who had been banned from drinking by his children. The so-called request was to rob the passing carriages of alcohol. When they heard this request, the two of them were in despair, but they also let out a sigh of relief. To be honest, although Rodney and the others were grateful to the Lord of the Forest for taking them in, the power sect couldn't accept a mission that was too hard. After all, everyone's condition wasn't too good. If Cade, the ancient tree sage who could command the werewolves, couldn't solve the problem, they would naturally have to pay a big price. If that was the case, the two of them would have to decline even if they had to bear the reputation of being ungrateful. However, it was different now. Isn't it shameful to rob others? This was undoubtedly shameful, especially for a level 3 origin ranker. He was practically a beggar, but he had to admit that it was very safe. The battle between the bandits and the Chamber of Commerce's convoy could be said to be a common occurrence in an area with poor security. However, no matter which side was involved in the battle, their strength was very low, and most of them didn't even have any origin substances. Who would be willing to be a caravan guard or a bandit if they were able to reach source rank 5? Wasn't the position of a captain in the army better? Of course, there were also some wanted extraordinaires who ended up as bandits. However, even if it was a bandit group that spanned across several noble families' territories, the leader would at most be a level 4 source rank extraordinaire. It was impossible for them to be a high-level extraordinaire. There was no other reason for this. It was because once a high-level superhuman appeared, the nature of the group would change. Every country would change the definition of a group at this level to that of a rebel army, and they would immediately send out troops to wipe them out. This was because they were a threat to national security. Because of this, the upper limit of a bandit was only level 4 source rank. Naturally, the weapons used to deal with the bandits were also limited to level 4 source rank. Isn't this risk-free? It was just a caravan transporting wine. Wouldn't it be easy for either of them to capture it? Rodney and Wood, who had been thinking for a long time, looked at each other. A relaxed smile appeared on their faces, and they patted their chests and accepted this matter. Isn't it just wine? We understand. Rob, we can rob. Anyway, this mountain was originally yours. Just treat it as a toll. The two level 3 source rank old foxes immediately agreed to this request. In their opinion, this was a small matter not worth mentioning. However, if they completed it, they would be able to leave with peace of mind. After relaxing, the two returned to the village and immediately began to make arrangements. The information from the trees couldn't describe the scale of the humans, so Rodney and the others didn't know how many guards the caravan had. To be on the safe side, they brought a lot of people this morning. The process of the ambush was relatively rough. Due to the lack of bows and arrows, the people of the power sect didn't occupy any commanding heights. The plan of Wood and the others was to force them to surrender. It was best not to hurt them. They would just rob the wine and leave to avoid trouble. After hearing that it was unlikely that they would fight, and that the things they robbed were only transported by a small caravan, the warriors of the power sect were even less nervous. Their camouflage was basically just hanging 3 or 2 branches on their bodies. It was only at noon that they covered themselves with weeds because the sun was too bright. In this situation where the ambush didn't look like an ambush and a nap didn't look like a nap, a small caravan of about 30 people came along the mountain road. However, what made Rodney and Wood a little strange was that before they entered the encirclement, the whole caravan suddenly stopped. What's going on? Could it be that they were exposed? The middle-aged man and the old man looked at each other. They knew that the ambush of the power sect was not professional enough. However, ordinary people shouldn't be able to discover it because Wood had specifically used an illusion spell. To see through this spell from such a distance, one would need to be at least level 3 source rank. Can there be a level 3 source rank expert in this team? How is it possible? It's a coincidence. Chapter 229. When the huge body wrapped in red light appeared in the valley of the Sharon Forest, everyone on the scene stopped moving. Whether it was Rodney and Wood who were shouting and waving their hands, or the warrior who was covered in leaves. All the believers of the Church of Strength paused at the same time. After the stiff feeling that made their blood seem to freeze, what followed was an unbearable heavy pressure. In a short moment, almost all the believers of Power Sect knelt on the ground and lowered their heads under the heavy pressure. Only Rodney and Wood, who were high-level extraordinaries, could barely stand. On the other side of the Perseverance sect, all the mercenaries also felt their bodies sink. They were notified in advance and did not panic, but the powerful presence of the Ghoul forced them to look away. Only Cynthia could barely look at this great existence for a while, but the more she observed, the more shocked she was. When one reached Cynthia's level, one's understanding of the gods would be clearer and more accurate. What kind of god, what kind of strength, these could be perceived by high-level extraordinaries. And now, in Cynthia's perception, this huge bloody skeleton was not inferior to the existence of the great mother goddess that she believed in. Double god sacrifice? How could it be? The shock in the woman's heart was indescribable with her eyes wide open. Normally, the ancient gods were harsh. They must be devout to those who could obtain their power. Not to mention 2 part-time jobs. Even if they married a woman that they did not like that much, they might lose their god's favor. However, all of this seemed to be ineffective on Luoya. Cynthia naturally did not know that the relationship between Luoya and Paitila and the others was based on an ancient equal contract. He was the guide who brought them back from their endless slumber. Such a relationship was mutually beneficial and was far from the charity of the gods to the believers. The brown-haired woman lowered her head to look at the boy in front of her. Suddenly, she felt that Luoya's strength had become unfathomable. On the other side, the people of Power Sect were completely silent until Wood's voice sounded. "Great existence, please forgive us for being disrespectful to the Son of God." During this hour, Luoya learned about the Church of Strength in detail, which was why the followers of the Ghoul had turned into a bunch of beggars. What surprised him was that it seemed to have something to do with the development of the Fringe by the House of Serophia. Because of this, Ai Lizzie sympathized with the Church of Strength and strongly condemned the evil forces led by Xiaoluot. Big brother, Xiaoluot is really a bad woman. While Ai Lizzie was attacking, Luoya looked at the scale that Rodney gave her and began to communicate with Paitila. Scale of the Serpent Goddess. This so-called sacred object was actually the scale of a serpent with the bloodline of Mother Earth. From Paitila's point of view, it was a relic left behind by a descendant of an unknown number of generations. The King of Holy Beasts would not take it seriously, but to some extent, it was not completely useless. Countless years after Petra's death, it was not easy to find a medium to carry the power of Mother Earth. The scales of this descendant of the same origin were rare. After Petra's blessing, it could become a powerful curse vessel. It was far from being comparable to when it was in Rodney's hands. It could only rely on a little bit of power after death to command the snakes. Needless to say, Power Sect was very traditional. Their respect and trust for Luoya were far higher than Fortitude Sect. Basically, all of them submitted to Luoya after meeting him. At that time, they didn't even know Luoya's name, let alone his status. Of course, there must be a reason why the Ghoul appeared directly. But even if it was the scale of the Serpent Goddess that had never been given to the cultists, Rodney and others did not hide it and directly gave it to Luoya. This was very commendable. According to Rodney and others, Power Sect's original plan was to set off to find Luoya in these few days. It was the first time they engaged in a business of robbery. They usually did not commit any crimes and did not get involved in any trouble. For these words, Luoya basically chose to believe after observing Rodney and others' attire. Indeed, with the strength of 2 source rank 3 extraordinaire in Power Sect, if they really engaged in the business of robbery, they would have become rich long ago. However, what Luoya cared about was their explanation of the reason for the robbery. "Oh, you're under someone's orders?" "That's right. We agreed to rob the caravan to repay the kindness of taking us in." "I see. But who is the master of the forest? Is he also a heretic from the Fringe?" "No, about that." Under Luoya's somewhat strange gaze, the stammering Rodney and Wood hesitated for a long time. In the end, they could only helplessly answer, The master of the forest is an ancient ent. Luo Yu's eyes widened when he heard the two's explanation. After a series of inquiries, the black-haired young man understood what happened and felt unprecedented helplessness and surprise. Luo Yu had never thought that there would be a day when he would be robbed by an ent. What was even more ridiculous was that the one who ordered the robbery was a Goulandair believer. When he learned that the ent who took in Rodney and the others had set his sights on the dozen barrels of disgusting Cardi wine that he transported, he immediately understood the meaning of Isha Bela's words in the historical fragment. Indeed, it seemed that there was no need for any method. As long as one brought a large amount of Cardi wine into the forest, anyone would be able to encounter the ent. But after thinking about it carefully, no caravan would be willing to transport such cheap and disgusting Cardi wine. It was even more impossible to bring a large amount of wine into the forest. In fact, after the peak of the adventure season, the mountain road to Sharon Forest was almost impassable. After understanding these matters, Luo Yu reckoned that the ent named Cade's claim of not drinking Cardi wine for almost 100 years might be true. After explaining his purpose, Rodney and the others who were conflicted about their kindness heaved a sigh of relief. The group of them walked together into the depths of the valley. In the deep forest of the valley, the huge oak tree was as still as ever. It was spring. The trees were sprouting, and the birds had also begun their large-scale activities. Sharon Forest had also begun its cycle as usual, but Cade's eyes did not open. In fact, one of the secrets of this old ent's long-term survival was staying at home. Chapter 230. When Luo Yu's name Akat entered the dark ear hole, the ancient ent finally found the meaning of this surname in his long memory. After understanding this surname, Cade also completely relaxed. Not an enemy. An old, hoarse voice came from the trunk, causing the monsters and werewolves that were gathering nearby to heave a sigh of relief. All kinds of monsters began to retreat in large batches. Shadows flashed in the darkness of the deep forest, and the number of shining eyes rapidly decreased. The restless werewolves also began to retreat in batches. Luo Yu calmly looked at the rapidly emptying forest. The crimson light on his body gradually dissipated, and the golden snake on his staff also slowly returned to the Hydra staff. A breeze blew, and the valley was calm, as if the countless monsters never came. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Cade. No, this is what I should do. But Akat, recently life is really a lot more interesting." The tall ent sighed, then looked up into the distance. Not knowing if it was an illusion, Luo Yu always felt that Cade's wooden eyes gradually lit up, and the next moment, the ent's voice came again. "But before that, cough cough, young man, do you have wine? Oh, this taste is still so familiar. Just like Orson's black soil, it's unforgettable." In the forest of the valley, the huge ent held a wooden barrel and poured pale yellow wine into the tree hole. The hoarse voice had a kind of enjoyment and joy, but the strange metaphor made Luo Yu show a strange expression. When Cade asked Luo Yu about wine, the black-haired boy showed a well-prepared smile. With a wave of his hand, Cynthia and others brought out more than a dozen barrels in one breath. In Luo Yu's opinion, this was enough, but he didn't expect that the ent didn't drink with the roots, but poured it into the hole. But it had to be said that after so many years, more than a dozen barrels of wine were enough for Cade to drink. The catty wine really scratched his itch, and Luo Yu had wine. So Cade's story came online. "Isha Bela, I don't know this name, but I know Queen, because in fact, I am also a member of the Twilight Sage Association. My code name is Recorder, burp." The ancient ent said with a burp, which made the black-haired boy a little shocked. Luo Yu didn't expect that the Twilight Sage Association would even recruit ents, but it was reasonable that Cade didn't know who Queen was. But why does the surname Akat seem familiar? For this question, the tall ent thought for a long time, and after drinking a mouthful of wine, he let out a hoarse and helpless sigh. "It's very simple, because I was a member's Twilight Sage Association, and the first president of the Sage Association, and he is your ancestor, eh?" Cade's words made the black-haired boy widen his eyes, and he couldn't help but reveal a dull question. "Akat Inald, this ent's hearing isn't very good, right?" Luoya thought so with a face full of doubts. Seeing this, the ant could only explain. The Auld family, that's the era you call the Second Era, a secret family that supported the Austin Empire and has been silently maintaining the peace of the human world. The Twilight Sage Association was originally established by them, and they recruited other races to resist various disasters together. But just like the growth of plants, there is a flourishing spring and summer, and there is a withering autumn and winter. The Twilight Sage Association suffered a major failure at the end of the Second Era, and the Austin Empire was destroyed. In order to avoid the pursuit of the Savior's believers, the Auld family was divided into 7, and one of the main branches was the Akkad family. Wait, let me take a break first. Luoya hurriedly reached out his hand to stop Cade's compressed biscuits, and the black-haired boy rubbed his brows and began to understand the meaning of the ant's words. What's the situation? The Twilight Sage Association was established by the Akkad family's ancestors? And what was the Auld family? He had never heard of such a family in the Austin Empire, and there was no trace of it in the history books. And what was the Savior? Cade, is the Savior some kind of god? Why would his followers hunt down the Auld family? The Savior? I'm not too sure about his identity. He already existed when I was born, but what I can be sure of is that he is not a god. Cade's tree-lined face showed a dignified expression and said in a low voice that is an ancient sleeping existence, the most terrifying madness and depravity, the destruction of prosperous civilizations and the extinction of mythical races has a lot to do with him. One of the goals of the Twilight Sage Association is to prevent his awakening, but because of my race, I have very little involvement in the affairs of the Sage Association, so I don't know the specific situation. Cade's description of the Savior made Luoya couldn't help but feel a chill on his back, but then his gaze shifted. Although the terrifying existence that was still sleeping was terrifying, the enemies in the real world needed more attention, such as the believers. The believers of the Savior? What do you mean? Chapter 231. On top of the tree, Luoya, who saw the message from hundreds of years ago, stood on top of Cade in a daze. For a moment, he couldn't react. He reached out and touched the engraving that occasionally flashed with a faint, dark golden light. Don't believe in Eggman. What does that mean? The black-haired youth pondered in his mind. Of course, he knew the meaning of Eggman. It was the name of the Austin Empire's royal family. However, the phrase, don't believe in it, was very strange because it basically represented the Akkad family. At least in Roy's generation, there was a connection with the Eggman family. To be honest, Luoya was very puzzled because Akkad territory was not connected to the Austin Empire geographically. When Roy wrote this message, he should only be around the age of adulthood. It was almost impossible for a child of this age to come into contact with the Austin Empire's royal family. Based on the fact that Roy was able to track them all the way to Sharon Forest, he should be a meticulous person. Such a person should not have a stereotypical impression of a place that he had never been to just based on books, or even engraved it for future generations. Then, the most likely reason was a fragment of history? Luoya muttered to himself. His gaze couldn't help but sharpen. At present, he could only speculate that Roy might have experienced something in the fragment of history. Everything else was too vague. But no matter what, he did receive a message from hundreds of years ago. After reading the message, the youth landed on the ground and didn't know what to say for a moment. He hadn't met anyone from the Eggman family until now, but in the academy next year, he would definitely face this bloodline. On the other side, the tall ant noticed that Luoya had landed on the ground and straightened his body. While drinking, he suddenly remembered something. By the way, is the girl who came here a while ago related to you? What? Towards Cade's question, Luoya couldn't help but raise his head and ask. Seeing the youth's surprised expression, the ant understood. So that's how it is. It seems that she isn't your companion. What's the situation? That was about a month ago. According to Cade, about a month ago, a young lady in full body armor suddenly appeared in Sharon Forest. Cade didn't pay much attention to this traveler, but he didn't expect her to come straight to him. It was obvious that the other party had come prepared, and their target was Cade. However, before the slow Tyrant could speak, the girl had already spoken, and the message she conveyed was unusually concise. Be careful, they may have found this place. This was all that the girl conveyed. After that, before Cade could react, the girl quickly left. She is most likely a descendant of one of the Twilight Sage Society's members. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been able to find me so accurately. As for what danger she mentioned, I don't know. Throughout the long history of the Twilight Sage Society, the Twilight Sage Society has made too many enemies. Luoya frowned deeply. Although he was glad that the descendants of the Sage Society members still existed in this world, he was more concerned about the enemy and the message and the safety of the ancient Tyrant in front of him. Cade, what are you going to do? You haven't moved at all for the past month, have you? That's true, but I don't have any other choice because I will be more conspicuous if I leave the forest. Cade sighed helplessly. As a 1,000-year-old Tyrant, it was fine for Cade to hide in the forest. Once he left the valley, he would be truly unique. If he didn't leave the valley, he would enter the land of chaos, and the soil there wasn't suitable for him to grow. In such a dilemma, Cade could only choose to defend himself. For this reason, he had recently gathered a lot of demons in the valley. That was why he was able to put up such a huge formation when Luoya came. Regarding the current situation, the ancient Tyrant was helpless, but the black-haired young man widened his eyes when he heard about these troubles. Indeed, in this world filled with humans, a Tyrant would be exposed as soon as he left the forest. But what if the humans transported him out? It was a wonder that a tree could walk on its own, but it wasn't surprising that a human transported a tree. As for where he would be transported to, there was nothing else in the southern mountains of Akot territory, but there were too many trees. If Cade could bring his entourage to live there, the strength of Akot territory would probably increase by leaps and bounds. Cade, if you believe me, how about coming to my territory? Luoya thought about it for a long time and felt that it was feasible, so he voiced out his idea. Hearing the young man's invitation, the tall Tyrant hesitated. But these cursed werewolves, as long as you can control them, you can transport them together, including the demons. But the risk of doing so, 5 barrels of wine a day. Let's go. Let's go. When do we leave? Chapter 232. A year later, in Blogna, the country of scholars. It was early spring, and the cold that had lasted for an entire winter in the capital, Leinster, was gradually disappearing, making people feel more comfortable. The trees on the streets were greener, and the pedestrians were wearing fewer clothes. Similar to the gradually warming weather, the city was also full of enthusiasm and vitality. There was no other reason, but it was the start of school season. Every spring, the capital of the country of scholars, Leinster, was known as the most lively place in the human world. The younger generation of all the countries in Shia would gather here, not only the nobles of the various countries, but also many people who came from afar. As a country where more than 80% of the schools in Shia gathered, there were many academies in Blogna, and Leinster, as the capital of Blogna, had the reputation of being the capital of academies. More than 60% of the areas in Leinster were educational institutions, among which there were more than 20 academies that only 14-year-old adults could enter. With so many academies recruiting students, it was natural that not only were the nobles recruited, but in fact, most of the academies were composed of commoners. Leinster Comprehensive Academy, Cecily Women's Academy, St. Wisdom's Academy, these were all famous academies funded by big schools, each with their own characteristics in different fields. But when it came to the most influential and powerful, there was only one answer, and that was St. Freya's Academy. St. Freya's Academy, the first academy in the Academy City, was built more than 900 years ago, and could be said to be as old as the country. In fact, the city of Leinster was originally built around St. Freya's Academy, but in the following few hundred years, due to the increasing number of students, it continued to expand, and finally reached its current scale. So how big was St. Freya's Academy's influence? This was a difficult question to answer, but according to St. Freya's biggest event every 100 years, the 100th anniversary of the school, it could be seen. All the heads of state had graduated from St. Freya's Academy, and according to Luoya's thinking in his previous life, they were basically the spokespersons of St. Freya's Academy, But this lineup of spokespersons was not as simple as just shocking, it was terrifying. Grasping the top resources, to a certain extent, would create a siphon effect, and St. Freya's Academy was the most typical example of this. When generations of emperors and kings graduated from this academy, their descendants and subordinates basically had no other choice. Unless they were stupid, they would do anything to get in. For example, the princes of various countries. When their fathers, grandfathers, and ancestors all attended St. Freya's school, it would unknowingly become a tradition. Even if they didn't want to, they had to consider whether they would be attacked by others, especially the conservative faction, if they changed schools. As for the nobles of the various countries, they had even less of a choice. Their own bosses were there, so how could they run away? As the first academy, St. Freya's Academy had started this virtuous cycle of excellent students hundreds of years ago. This advantage had continued to this day, and the reason why it was able to maintain its dominance in Bologna, the country of education, was not only because of its excellent students, but also because it had enough money. After so many years, when the graduates recalled their school days after experiencing the vicious beating of society, they would feel an indescribable sense of beauty. This did not only exist in Luo Yu's previous life, but also in Shiya. Or rather, after experiencing the intrigue and swords, Shiya's nobles had a deeper feeling. However, unlike the graduates of other academies, those who reminisced about St. Freya's Academy in their dreams were all big shots. Every year, the Academy's annual donations accounted for more than half of its income, so strictly speaking, this academy was funded by the nobles of Shiya. St. Freya's Academy could be said to be the best in the Academy city of Leinster, but compared to its great reputation, there were not many students here. Therefore, the students who wore the Book of Truth badge of St. Freya's Academy naturally stood out in this city where students made up more than 50% of the population. For example, right now, on a chair by the side of the road leading to the academy area, a young man attracted the attention of many young people passing by. It's a male student from St. Freya's Academy. Sure, lower your voice. Looks like he's a noble, and his rank is probably not low. On the far side of the street, a few girls from Cecily Girls' Academy gathered together and chatted, their eyes occasionally stealing glances at the black-haired young man on the opposite side of the street. Nearby, there were several small groups like this. During their time as a student, some people chose to study hard to enrich themselves, while others chose to use their youth to fall in love. Everyone's choice was different, and each had their own exciting moments. But in the city of Leinster, the hormones of puberty seemed to be secreted more than in other places. It couldn't be helped. No matter how they tried to hide it, humans were animals who followed their instincts. Being attracted to outstanding members of the opposite sex was a necessity engraved in their genes. And the city of Leinster was the cradle of the young generation. Under the fame of St. Freya's Academy, its students were added with a layer of luxurious background. For girls from Cecily Girls' Academy, which had a 0 male-to-female ratio, it was almost a natural attraction. They looked at people with prejudice, not to mention the fact that the young man opposite them was so outstanding. It was a black-haired young man wearing a dark-colored coat. His appearance was handsome, his body was slender, and his calm and gentle temperament made people feel good about him. His pair of golden eyes were noble and mysterious, and his whole body exuded the noble elegance of a superior noble. At this moment, the young man was reading a book with his head lowered. From the old packaging and yellowed paper, it should be an ancient book with a long history. Beside him, a classical cane was placed. The streets were crowded with people during the school season, and noise was inevitable. But around the young man reading the book, there was a strange sense of tranquility. Wouldn't it be unladylike to ask for his name? Is he a freshman or a senior? It doesn't matter. Hurry up and decide. If you dawdle, the girls from St. Westwood's Academy will beat you to it. The girl groups looked at each other anxiously from afar. No one wanted to let the other get ahead of them. But in Shiya, most girls were more conservative, especially those who had just entered the academy not long ago. It took a lot of courage to hit on a man. Just as they were monitoring each other and discussing endlessly, the black-haired young man on the opposite chair moved. Chapter 233. Luo Yaakit was a cautious person. This was the common evaluation of everyone who knew him since his reincarnation. From the moment Luo Ya came to this world, he knew that he was not the chosen one. A strong sense of crisis accompanied him for a long time. Even after being accompanied by the girls, Luo Ya still had some strong after-effects. One of the most important was the reverence for the plot. After living in Shia for so many years, Roha didn't think that the Recorder's Eye was a simple game anymore. This world was undoubtedly realistic. It wasn't so much a Galga as it was. In desperation, the Chosen One could only look at the abstract map and walk silently. As a result, he didn't look left and right when crossing the road and just happened to block the carriage of the Serofia family. He even almost startled the horse, which angered Xia Luot, who was in a hurry in the carriage. He was reprimanded by the red-haired lady. And this was the first meeting between Paul and Xia Luot. It could be said that the plot of the two people after that began to extend from this point. Of course, that was in the game. In reality, everything would change, because Luo Yaakit was here. What the hell is this thing that Lisa drew? On the busy street, Paul Ackman looked at the map in his hand with black lines all over his head. He repeatedly looked up at the surroundings and looked down to compare the map with his face full of bewilderment. It had been a month since Paul came to this city called Leinster, but in fact, the number of times he really went out of the house could be counted on one hand because the purpose of him coming here was for closed special training. As an illegitimate child found by the spies of the Austin Empire half a year ago, Paul's 16 years of life so far could be said to be quite dull. He grew up as an orphan in a remote village of the Austin Empire and did not receive much education from a young age. He only learned literacy and arithmetic from the retired priest in the village. The rest of the time was basically engaged in agricultural work. At that time, Paul never thought that his life would change in any way. It was not until he was almost kidnapped from the village by the spies that Paul's world changed dramatically. He suddenly became the prince of the Austin Empire. He had an emperor father who looked only middle-aged but was actually more than 100 years old. He had two brothers who disliked him to the extreme and an elder sister whom he had never met. This was his experience in the capital of the Austin Empire, Theo. As for the most feelings, it was probably hostility and malice. The two princes of the Austin Empire were close to 30 years old, and Princess Lillian had already shown her talent. The political camp division was quite clear. In other words, there was no room for others to intervene. An illegitimate child who had low extraordinary strength, no culture, and no background. He had been wandering outside for more than 10 years, was destined to be unpopular in politics of the Austin Empire. And the nobles. Paul had lived in the capital for more than 3 months. During this period, there were 0 nobles who visited him, which could be said to be the most obvious feedback. And it was precisely because of this that Emperor Lucas of the Austin Empire had no choice but to let Paul go to school at the age of 16 to make up for the shortcomings in all aspects caused by the years of wandering outside. The 1-month closed-door training involved various fields such as politics, history, language, etiquette, swordsmanship, spells, and so on. However, even with so much training, Paul still didn't make any significant progress, especially in the aspect of extraordinary strength. He always felt that he was lacking something. But it had to be said that although he didn't get along well with the nobles, Paul got along well with the servants. As for the current situation, it was an accident. Originally, Paul's trip alone this time was a measure by the social class teacher to cultivate his self-confidence. As a student of the St. Freya Academy, he should have received the envious gazes of passers-by while wearing the badge of the Book of Truth. The difficulty of asking for directions would be halved, and he might even be hit on by girls. But the reality was that he forgot to bring it. Without the badge, he only had a map casually drawn by the maid. The huge flow of people in the big city made Paul, who grew up in the village and lived in a society of acquaintances, very uncomfortable. He called out to several girls in a row, but they all rolled their eyes at him. Probably, should I cross the road from here? Enduring the anxiety and pressure in his heart, Paul muttered to himself according to the map, but what he didn't expect was that at this time, a gentle voice suddenly sounded next to him. No, you should keep going straight. Huh. Hearing the answer, Paul, who was taken aback, raised his head and saw a smiling black-haired boy. A dark suit jacket, a white lining, a neat and beautiful bow tie, a slender but slightly thin body, and golden eyes shining with gentle light. The moment he saw Luoya, Paul was stunned for a moment, and he understood one thing reflexively in his mind. This is an aristocrat. Paul looked at the boy in front of him who seemed to be glowing. Thinking so, he couldn't help but lower his head with some inferiority. Luoya was taken aback when he saw this. He thought for a moment and asked, "Student, are you looking for the St. Freya Academy?" "Ah, yes, student?" "Yes, you are a student." Luoya reached out and pointed at the badge of the Book of Truth on his chest, smiling at the confused boy. Paul's eyes widened when he saw this, and he hurriedly thanked him. Thank you for your help, senior. I am a freshman this year. It is my first time coming to the academy." Like I said before, your surname is not your fault. This cannot be changed. What kind of person you are is the most important. The black-haired boy still had a gentle smile on his face. He was not angry at Xia Luo's departure at all. In fact, Luo Ya's heart was filled with gratitude and joy. It can be changed. It can really be changed. This world is real, and the power of the plot does not exist. Luo Ya clenched his fists in excitement. Recalling the hard work of the past 5 years, his heart was filled with emotions. On the other side, Paul Ackman was equally excited. Shia above, such a righteous person. Before coming to St. Freya Academy, Paul was fearful of this world-famous academy. After all, since he entered the upper class, almost everyone he came into contact with was his enemy. However, in this city, there was actually a student who did not discriminate against him. This gave him great encouragement. Perhaps, life in the academy is not that bad? Paul held such hope in his heart and walked in the direction of the academy with Luoya. The two people chatted casually and quickly became familiar with each other. Men's friendship was often simple and direct. From knowing each other to becoming friends, there was no need for formal inquiries like in movies and TV series. Instead, it was hidden in the words of chatter and the tacit understanding of looking at each other with a smile. There was no need to think like when facing a girl. It was pure and direct. In the process of getting along, Paul found that Luoya was a very knowledgeable person. Along the central road leading to St. Freya Academy, he could tell the history of many buildings along the way and tell the anecdotes of many famous people here. For Paul, who grew up in a remote mountain village in the Austin Empire, the boy's knowledge was beyond his reach. After discovering Luo Ya's brilliance, Paul's respect for him increased again. Taking this opportunity, Paul could not help but raise his doubts about St. Freya Academy. St. Freya Academy, although the name was repeatedly mentioned by the teachers, in fact, Paul was not clear about the specific situation. After all, no one had any expectations for him. The teachers only told him not to cause any trouble. Intelligence resources were still a luxury for Paul at this stage. Luoya was actually clearer than anyone about the situation of the boy who came with him, so he did not ask much. Instead, he chose to calmly tell the information he knew. St. Freya Academy was a school that, to a certain extent, transcended the city of academies of Leinster. Historically speaking, St. Freya Academy was established earlier than Leinster City, and from a high-level perspective, the Dean of St. Freya Academy, Antonio Cole, was the Speaker of the Parliament of the Country of Scholars. He was the real leader of this country. Looking at the boy in front of her who put his palms together and begged her, Luo Ya's expression became weird. But after thinking about it, she felt relieved. Indeed, if she looked at it from Paul's point of view without the player's point of view, being blocked on the first day of school was undoubtedly a disaster. As an illegitimate child, Paul didn't want to attract too much attention. Is this the butterfly effect? I didn't expect that even Lillian's side was accidentally destroyed. Luoya nodded in the boy's pleading eyes and followed the senior to write the registration form. When she saw Paul's surname, the female student's face changed obviously. But since the procedures were complete, she could only let the two of them go. By the way, senior, can I ask what the building in that direction is? Luoya pointed to a white building in the direction of her perception and asked, trying to find some clues for her strange feeling just now. However, after learning Paul's identity, the female student's attitude suddenly turned cold. I don't know. I see. The black-haired boy didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he stared in that direction and pondered. After hesitating for a moment, Luoya gave up the idea of rushing over now. The information obtained from the resonance at that moment was too little. It was almost useless in the school where the flow of people and the density of the population was very high. If she ran over now, Luoya wouldn't be able to distinguish which one was the resonator. Thinking of this, the boy could only shake his head and continue walking. Although Luoya was very puzzled by this situation, resonance was something that would happen sooner or later as long as one lived in the school. Now, it seemed that the entrance ceremony was more important. Luoya, thank you. After walking for a distance, Paul, who was clutching his chest with an expression of having escaped a disaster, said so sincerely. The black-haired boy didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Chapter 237. Lillian Aikman was an extremely complicated and contradictory girl, which originated from her family. Family was often a paradise for underage girls, but for Lillian, who was part of the royal family of the Austin Empire, family was the source of torture. Everyone knew about the current situation of the Austin Empire. It had been more than 10 years since Lillian's two brothers graduated from St. Freya Academy, but the two had not made any breakthroughs in their extraordinary powers. The fierce internal strife had been going on for a long time, and it had only intensified in recent years as Lillian grew up. There was no kinship in the royal family. This sentence could not be more appropriate to describe the royal family of the Austin Empire. Insidious schemes and vicious traps were the most gifts the girl received from her two blood relatives. As for her parents, Lillian was just a tool in their eyes. One was a tool for inheritance, and the other was a tool for maintaining their own prosperity and wealth. She was not replaced because she was the best. The ugliness of human nature was exposed to Lillian early on, causing the girl to give up on her family, which was just a facade. However, this was also the reason why Lillian was conflicted. Just like how the more you lacked something, the more you yearned for it. Deep in Lillian Aikman's heart, she was extremely eager to have a real family, to love and care for each other, to have a deep, unchangeable, and inseparable relationship. This was the real family in Lillian's heart. In the past, this could only be an unachievable dream for the girl, but today, Lillian found that she had a chance. It was just that it was not a family by blood, but a family by blood. Blood and bloodline were two completely different concepts in Shia. Blood was brought to the child by the parents from birth, while bloodline was awakened by oneself. The two seemed similar, but in fact, they were completely different. Take Luoya, for example. Luoya's relative by blood was his father, Kadia. His relatives by blood were the previous generation of Awakened, Roy Aikman, and the previous generation's Vincent Aikman. Luoya and Vincent's era were more than 800 years apart. From the perspective of bloodline, there was not much difference between them after dozens of generations of dilution. However, if Vincent met Luoya, he would definitely accept him because the two of them had the same bloodline, which meant that they must have come from the same source. This was an indelible objective fact. In Shia, this kind of unique bloodline connection was considered noble and unique to extraordinaires. Most of the time, it was only found in clans that possessed exclusive source substances. However, in rare cases, two people who were completely unrelated to each other could find each other due to their similar bloodlines. The method was resonance. In other words, it was very likely that there was a blood relative of Lillian in the academy after the resonance. Stroking her chest, the black-haired girl's heart was in turmoil, but she had no idea what to do. The source substance kingdom, was the source substance that the Austen Empire's royal family possessed. However, in reality, it was not a bloodline-exclusive source substance. Instead, it was a product that most people could accept, like mercy. However, the Austen Empire's royal family had monopolized it since ancient times, and as the ruling clan, they were very adaptable to kingdom. Because of this, even among the Aikman who used kingdom source substance, there was no commonality between awakened bloodlines. In other words, the reason Lillian was so powerful was because the bloodline she had awakened was more powerful than others, making it stand out among all the other bloodlines. In fact, Lillian had always felt that her bloodline might have an exclusive source substance, but as a core member of the Austen Empire, her identity as the imperial princess meant that she had to accept kingdom source substance. Otherwise, she would become a political target for others to use against her. From an objective point of view, kingdom was indeed one of Shi Yu's best source substances. Although exclusive source substances were closer to one's bloodline, they might not be as powerful as kingdom. In fact, in the long history of the Austen Empire, there were precedents of the Austen Empire's royal family choosing exclusive source substances, but the results were not satisfactory. Lillian's bloodline and source substance did not come from the same source, so there were two possibilities for the resonance that had appeared in her body. Resonance. Judging from the direction of the school gate, it should be a new student. If we're talking about the source substance resonance, it should be that Paul Aikman. The young girl, who was talking to herself, frowned slightly. Indeed, in terms of bloodline, Paul Aikman was her brother and sister, and they both had kingdom origin substance. It was most likely that the two of them would resonate with each other. However, Paul's identity made Lillian somewhat sensitive. An illegitimate child. In Lillian's eyes, who had been educated as a noble since she was young, this was a scandal of the Austen Empire's royal family. To be honest, Lillian did not want to have anything to do with this person. If the resonance was really him, Lillian would probably be very conflicted. Of course, there was another possibility, which was that it was not a source substance, but a more fundamental bloodline resonance. However, when she thought about this possibility, Lillian's eyes dimmed. Bloodline users were 1 in a million. Someone who had awakened the same extraordinary bloodline as Lillian, entered the same school in the same era, and happened to have a resonance. The probability of such a thing happening was probably so low that it could not be calculated. That's true. How could there be such a fate in this world? The black-haired girl who had calmed down sighed at her own extravagant hope. She slowly walked back to the table, and then her gaze sank slightly. At this moment, there was an exquisite letter in the middle of the table. The familiar double eagle symbol on the wax represented the Austen Empire's royal family. However, unlike the past, this letter was not written by someone else. It was written by the Austen Empire's emperor, Lucas. The meaning of the handwritten letter was self-evident. The contents of the letter were undoubtedly important. The black-haired girl naturally knew this. Therefore, after carefully opening the letter, she carefully read it. However, the contents of the letter left her rather confused. There were roughly 2 points in the letter. The first point was to ask Lillian not to let Paul Aikman, who had entered the school this year, have a hard time. Lillian had already guessed this request. After all, no matter what, Paul now carried the name of the Aikman family. However, the second point was completely unexpected to Lillian. Don't get close to the Akot family. That was the content of the second paragraph, and Lillian also sensed that this was the true purpose of Lucas' letter. The Akot family was a great noble family in the Saint Maester theocracy. As the Empress, Lillian had naturally heard of it. However, she was not allowed to get close to this family. What was the reason behind this obviously hostile order? The black-haired girl pondered for a long time, but still could not figure it out. She could only pick up the student file placed on the side and flip through it again. Luoya Akot. Looking at the name on the file, Lillian began to ponder in the empty room. Chapter 238. So many people of the same age. Walking on the vast lawn behind the school gate, Paul Aikman, who grew up in a mountain village, looked left and right. He was obviously not used to the current situation. Beside him, The black-haired youth was smiling helplessly. It had to be said that the current situation in St. Freya Academy was indeed somewhat nerve-wracking. Whether it was the scene or the people gathered, they were all too imposing. After entering the solemn school gate, Luo Ye and the others were faced with a vast lawn plaza. The area was at least several football fields in Luo Ye's previous life, and there was even an illusion that one could not see the end of it. Everywhere in the plaza were statues of famous teachers of St. Freya Academy in the past 1,000 years. Not to mention the past sages, the current Dean Antonio, the Vice Dean Campbell, the year directors of each year, and the famous Sage Mentor all had statues here. Sage Mentor was a unique title of St. Freya Academy. It meant that they had nurtured more than 100 outstanding graduates. 100 outstanding graduates did not seem like a lot, but it was actually very difficult because St. Freya Academy's model was that it was easy to enter, but difficult to leave. St. Freya Academy's entrance was actually not difficult, mainly because the tuition was expensive. However, it was very difficult to graduate from this school normally. In fact, every year there were many people who dropped out or repeated a year because of the lack of credits. The requirements for outstanding graduates were different from ordinary ones. They needed to be proficient in both literature and martial arts, and their credits were ranked in the top 100 of the school. Literature was needless to say. It was basically the same as the quality education in Luo Ye's previous life, but there were some aristocratic classes such as etiquette. In theory, if a graduate wanted to successfully graduate, they would need to pass at least 20 literature courses. As for martial arts, it was naturally extraordinary strength. There were more ways to obtain it, but it was roughly divided into two types. One was the school ranking battle. This method was simple and straightforward. To put it bluntly, it was a fighting ring. Both sides would fight, and whoever was better would go up. Anyway, they were all in the school, so they would definitely not die. However, the corresponding credits given were actually not that much. The reason was that this ranking system was very unfair, because there was no division of grades, but rather a ranking of the entire school. From this point of view, in a 4-year school, the higher the grade, the greater the advantage, and in fact, the top 100 were indeed 3rd and 4th-year students. As for why it was designed this way, Luo Ye reckoned that a large part of the reason was to let the graduates freeload off credits. At the end of the day, the teachers of St. Freya Academy were not evil spirits. No one wanted to keep a large number of students who could not graduate, especially those who were mediocre in the aspect of supernatural powers and could not go out to do missions. Even if they exchanged their academic credits for martial sciences at a 10-to-1 ratio, they would not be able to fill the hole. At this time, the ranking battle was useful. In this kind of situation where they could make up for the extra credits at the end of the term, the juniors were generally willing to give up a spot to their seniors. Of course, it was impossible to place too high up in the rankings, because there was a ranking list for the top 20. It would be broadcasted every month, and when there were real-time changes, it would also be broadcasted to the entire school. In fact, the top 20 ranking battles, as long as it was an open battle, would always be filled with spectators. It was considered a big event in the school. Without a doubt, the top 20 ranking battle was a great tool to increase one's reputation. It was also the goal of many youths in the school who had nowhere to vent their adolescent hormones. Do you want to be the school's idol? If you do, then go to the ranking battle. Of course, other than these dream chasers, there was another group of people who had to fight their way up, and that was the ring bearers. As the school's leaders, the ring bearers had great power, but they also needed to prove themselves with commensurate abilities. The ranking battle was the simplest and most straightforward way, and also the best way to deter those who intended to offend them. For example, the current ranking list, the top 3 were the 3 ring bearers. For the ring bearers, the ranking list was a form of publicity, and the corresponding credits were dispensable. The second way to obtain credits in martial arts was to go out and complete missions. St. Freya Academy was one of the places where the schools gathered, and there were all kinds of magical materials required. Old professors from the archaeology department led teams to explore ruins, secret realms, and the neighboring countries asked for help. All kinds of missions were endless, and the credits were generally high. But correspondingly, going out to do missions was different from the ranking battle in the school. There was a certain degree of danger. Although the teachers who led the teams would do their best to avoid accidents, there would be a relatively big accident every 10 years or so. From this point of view, going out to do missions did not seem to be very cost-effective. After all, it was just school, and there was no need to take risks for credits. But in fact, many people who frequently participated in missions were not for credits, but for the growth of their supernatural powers. As the saying went, actual combat was the fastest way to grow, and going out to do missions could be said to be a kind of actual combat with a certain degree of insurance. It could even be said that high-ranking extraordinaires could become one's personal bodyguard. For many nobles, this was a treatment that they could not enjoy except in school. And the knowledge learned from interacting with high-ranking extraordinaires, as well as the insights gained from watching them fight, these were priceless treasures that would be of great help to one's future development. For these people who thirsted for improvement, going out to do missions was really high risk, but high reward. There were actually quite a number of students who had such thoughts in the school, and there were also groups with similar thoughts, but the people who followed them were different, and that was the ring-bearers. Among the many privileges of the ring-bearers, one of them was that they could lead their own team to go out on missions. In this kind of situation where there was no help from the school, the credits for completing missions would be greatly increased or even doubled, and the rewards and reputation of the mission would all belong to the team member. Accumulating reputation was a very important thing for the ring-bearers, especially the heirs of the country. As for how important it was, the most representative and the most famous was the dragon-slaying incident of the Austin Empire a few hundred years ago. Of course, although it was called a dragon, it was not the kind that only existed in myths and were active in ancient times. Instead, it was a sub-dragon that did not even have wings, and was probably at the level of Source Rank 3. The incident should have happened more than 600 years ago, when the human world was not completely stable yet. From time to time, monsters would come out to stir up trouble. Among them, a sub-dragon at the border of the Austin Empire was a big trouble. At that time, the second-in-line heir of the Austin Empire was the ring-bearer of St. Freya's Academy. After some investigation, he joined forces with another ring-bearer of the Austin Empire to take on the dragon-slaying mission, and after a bloody battle, they succeeded in killing the sub-dragon. This dragon-slaying incident that did not have a mentor to lead the team shocked the whole Austin Empire at that time, and brought great fame and social resources to the prince. At that time, the members of the team were mostly descendants of the famous families of the Austin Empire. After this battle, they all persuaded their families to change their stance and support the second prince. Regardless of their previous relationship, the great honor of dragon slaying had united them as a whole, and in this case, it was definitely in the team's interest to have their former leader become the emperor. Chapter 239. The black-haired teenager looked at the students who were staring at Paul from the side, then looked up at the familiar blonde figure surrounded by the crowd in front of him. Finally, he looked around and sighed. At the same time, he was relieved. If Luoya remembered correctly, this should be the last scene of Paul and Ackerman's encounter. Who in the world wanted Paul to disappear the most? In the plot of Recorder's Eye, it might have been Luoya, but in reality, everything had changed. Luoya obviously had no such need, and the throne of the villain was naturally left to the other two. They were Paul's two good brothers. Since ancient times, internal strife was often the best explanation. The current situation of the Austin Empire was the best example. As an illegitimate child, Paul Ackerman's talent was mediocre, but even so, the two princes of the Austin Empire were still worried. In fact, they didn't want Paul to go to school at all, because going to school was equivalent to having the hope of progress. Paul's hope of being promoted to a high-level extraordinaire was despair for them. Therefore, when Paul entered the academy, he was a gift from the two good brothers. After more than 10 years of running the Austin Empire's aristocracy, how could the academy lack their lackeys? Luoya silently observed the two people running over with his cane. He didn't mean to make the first move. After all, no one could predict the future under normal circumstances. On the other hand, Luoya and Paul had only known each other for less than an hour. Now, he just had to wait for the right time. The black-haired teenager thought so as he bid farewell to Paul and walked a little further away, silently observing the front. Paul Ackerman looked at the nearby scenery, and his heart gradually calmed down from the initial panic. Slowly, there was a trace of joy. There were thousands of peers nearby. This was something Paul had never experienced before, so of course, it made him a little nervous. But after the nervousness, Paul also cheered up and realized that this was a new stage. This was not the Austin Empire, and the composition of the students was also from all over the world. Not many people here knew him, and the disgust and criticism of the aristocrats had disappeared. With the identity of a student, most people were relatively equal. As long as he worked hard on the new stage of the academy, his situation might really change. Paul strolled forward while thinking about the future, but after a few steps, he was suddenly stopped. "Hey, are you Paul? May I know who you are? We're your seniors." He's right, the third son of Count Rick. "I'm Carlo, the second son of Count Queezer. We're here for a simple reason. We want you to do something for us." Do something? On the lawn, two men, one tall and one short, blocked the young man's way. After hearing that both of them were nobles of the Austin Empire, Paul's face immediately turned gloomy. When he heard the purpose of the two men, the young man had a bad premonition. The facts proved that Paul's premonition was right. As if echoing him, the tall and thin Carlo said faintly, "It's nothing much. I just hope that you can quit school on your own." Quit school? That's right. You know the current situation in the country. The throne is in the hands of the two princes. You, an illegitimate child, have no right to inherit it. Can't you just be a piece of trash? Don't cause trouble for yourself. Carlo looked down at Paul's cold face and said these obviously insulting words. There was no fear in his heart. For an illegitimate child with no right to inherit, even if he was of Aikman blood, there was nothing to be afraid of. No matter which of the two princes became the new emperor, Paul would be suppressed for life. The possibility of a comeback was almost zero. But if he could drive him out of the academy, Carlo, as the second son, might be able to get the appreciation of Paul's elder brother, Prince Aubrey, and might even inherit the title. Behind him, right, as the third son of the Count, had the same idea. For a lifetime of glory and wealth, the two of them were willing to gamble. But unfortunately, their target was obviously unwilling to cooperate. "Are you kidding me? I refuse." The anger of being insulted burned in his heart. Paul, who just had hope in the academy, clenched his fists with anger. He didn't expect that after entering the academy, he would encounter the obstruction of his two brothers. This made him disheartened, and at the same time, he also broke out in rebellion. Seeing him like this, Carlo and the others' faces turned gloomy. "Brat, it seems that you don't know what's good for you. I think you wanna wait, right? Don't be anxious." It seems that our Prince Paul hasn't fully understood his position. "Then let me explain it to him." Carlo stretched out his hand and stopped his burly companion. His face showed a mocking smile, and his eyes looked up and down at the young man. "Junior Paul, looking at you, don't tell me you still have some expectations for the academy life? What?" Chapter 240. There was still an hour before the opening ceremony. The lawn square in front of the auditorium was filled with people. Thousands of freshmen were looking forward to the beautiful scenery of St. Freya Academy. But in the corner of the square, the atmosphere was somewhat different. "What are you kneeling for? Stand up." The black-haired boy supported Paul's knees with his cane. His cold and majestic voice came from above. Paul, who had his head lowered, was slightly stunned. The next moment, the heavy pressure on his body suddenly disappeared. He could not help but raise his head in surprise. "Luoya." Paul muttered the boy's name with a surprised expression. The current Luoya gave him a completely different feeling from before. In the past, Luoya gave him the impression of a gentle and elegant aristocrat who liked to read books. But now, the Luoya gave him the impression of majesty. Under the faint light of the spell, the boy's golden eyes shone. His black hair and clothes fluttered in the wind. His calm expression and firm eyes seemed to be silently telling something, showing that he was far more experienced than ordinary people. Under Luo Ya's powerful appearance, the nearby shouts gradually subsided. Carlo and Wright looked at each other with surprise. They looked at the unknown Luo Ya and hesitated for a moment. On the other side, the boy also sighed silently in his heart. Unexpectedly, the plot had changed. Luo Ya recalled the plot in Recorder's Eye, and his heart was full of doubts. Normally, the last part of the first act of Paul Ackerman's story should be that Paul pretended to agree to drop out of school during his conversation with the other party, and then sprinted toward the auditorium while shouting for help. This kind of behavior was quite in line with Paul's current strength. After all, as a level 5 source ranker, facing 2 level 4 source rankers, there was no other way but to run. In fact, this kind of behavior did attract the attention of the Nuwa Ire, and then Miss Angel came to the rescue and got to know Paul. Such a big scene. No matter what, the Nuwa Ire must have seen it. Forget it. I'll just treat it as doing good deeds. Luo Ya helplessly turned his head and looked at Carlo, who was looking at him vigilantly. The latter hesitated for a moment and cautiously began to ask questions. This student, you should be a new student, right? May I ask who you are? Luo Ya Akat of the Theocracy of Saint Maester. Theocracy? Then why are you meddling in other people's business? Upon hearing Luo Ya's name, the 2 men heaved a sigh of relief. Although the Church of Saint Maester was powerful, they couldn't do anything to the Austin nobles. After learning about Luo Ya's background, the 2 men's tone became even more unbridled. Kid, I advise you to mind your own business. This is an internal affair of the Austin Empire. That's right. This matter has nothing to do with you. Please leave quickly. Carlo warned with an unkind expression, and the nearby students also started to talk about it. Paul, as the prince of the Austin Empire, didn't have a good relationship with Luo Ya's country. In the distance, the students surrounding the blonde girl also frowned. Your Highness, Lord Luo Ya, it doesn't matter. Just keep watching. Nuwa Ire looked at the figure in front of her and gradually relaxed her brows. With a smile, she stopped everyone's doubts. In the distance, the black-haired boy stole a glance at Miss Angel and heaved a sigh of relief. Although the reality of the situation had changed, and Paul wouldn't run to Nuwa Ire's side, Luo Ya still chose to stop this farce. There were 2 main reasons for this. The most important one was that Luo Ya felt that in this situation, even if Paul didn't cry for help, Nuwa Ire wouldn't turn a blind eye to it. Having known Nuwa Ire for several years, Luo Ya knew Heathcliff too well. Although Nuwa Ire often couldn't control his desire to abuse her, putting aside this small flaw, Nuwa Ire's nature was just like her origin substance. She was kind and righteous. In the face of this kind of ugly bullying, no matter who the victim was, Nuwa Ire would intervene. And the other reason was Roha's own perception of the situation. You guys are a little disgusting. What did you say? In front of the 2 unfriendly people, the black-haired boy said with disgust as if he was looking at something disgusting. Bullying the weak. In terms of pure blood, the 2 of you have perfectly inherited the fine tradition of the Austin Empire. Your purity is so high that I want to vomit. Hee hee, I didn't expect to be provoked here. Boy, you should have thought about the consequences of doing this, right? Be careful. After listening to Luo Ya's straightforward words, Carlo, who had no restrictions on the nobles of the theocracy, couldn't stand it anymore. He condensed the curse power on his body, and his right hand swelled into the claws of a giant beast and swung at the black-haired boy. Paul, who was on the side, hurriedly reminded him, but surprisingly, the boy didn't move at all. You want to fight? Sure, but not with me. Chapter 241. On the square, amidst the beast shadows and chaos, Lillian Aikman and Luo Ya Akat looked at each other across the air. Their eyes were full of indifference. Don't trust Aikman. The black-haired boy looked at the woman in the high place, and the message he saw on the tree man in the Sharon forest flashed in his heart. There was no doubt that the message from the ancestors had a great impact on Luo Ya. It made him more vigilant when facing the Aikman family except for Paul, who was an illegitimate child, especially Lillian Aikman. Everyone knew the situation in the Austin Empire today. Whether it was the eldest prince, Lucas Aikman, or the second prince, Aubrey Aikman, they were all well-known trash. They couldn't do anything at all. The only threat he could meet was Lillian. Although they only looked at each other once, Luoya could clearly feel the hostility and indifference in Lillian's purple eyes. In fact, his body was indeed shrouded under the pressure of this Lady Purple Rose, so he could basically be sure of one thing. As one of the heroines, Lillian Aikman, who had no contact with Luoya at all, was basically the same as in the original work. She still had inexplicable hostility toward him, and Luoya had no intention of gaining the favor of this Lady Purple Rose now. After roping in Nua Iyer, Xia Luot, and Ai Lizi, Lillian alone could no longer pose a threat to him. On the other hand, even if Luoya wanted to gain her favor, it would be a waste of effort because he didn't have the conditions to do so. Lillian Aikman looked incomparably cold, but she was actually a hidden brother complex. As for why it was hidden, it was because she had never had a brother so far. In the game recorder's eye, Lillian's favor for Paul was not high at the beginning, but as time passed, Lillian's brother complex would gradually awaken. As her brother, Paul would receive more and more care from her. It was almost an easy win. Regarding this situation, Luoya concluded that it should be the rebound caused by Lillian's extreme lack of familial love since childhood. Her obsession with her family was beyond imagination, and regardless of their real blood relationship, Paul was at least her brother in name. As for caring about her, being completely different from the rest of the Austin royal family and so on, these were all secondary in Luoya's eyes. A Seisai, who didn't know how to do that. With an ice beauty sister who treated you wholeheartedly, who wouldn't want to be a Seisai? If they weren't her family, they wouldn't be able to gain her trust, and they wouldn't be able to break through her impenetrable heart. Everything else would be for naught. The lack of hardware made Luoya give up on building a good relationship with Lillian. At the same time, the black-haired young lady had the same intention. She recalled the long-awaited letter from her father. Do not approach the Akkad family. This was an order from His Majesty, and as a princess, Lillian had to obey it. But the young lady didn't think that this approach was a physical approach. It was obvious that if there were people in this world who would cause problems for Lillian by getting close to them, the Austin Empire wouldn't simply send a letter. This approach should mean getting close to them, which meant that Lillian mustn't interact with the Akkad family. Even though she didn't know the reason, if that was the case, avoiding contact or maintaining vigilance and hostility would be the simplest way. As a matter of fact, Lillian had decided not to have any interactions with Luoya and Luoya. But she didn't expect Luoya to appear beside Paul. Conspiracy. This was the first word that popped up in Lillian's mind after discovering Luoya by Paul's side. One was the illegitimate son of the Austin Empire who had just been found half a year ago, while the other was the son of a marquis who had received a complete aristocratic education in the Saint Maester theocracy. Be it their past experiences or the environment they grew up in, they were worlds apart. Lillian didn't think that they would have anything in common, let alone become friends within the first hour of school. All in all, it was a big problem for someone from the Saint Maester theocracy to get close to Paul, the illegitimate son of the emperor. No matter if Luoya's target was Paul or if he approached her through Paul, it could be determined that he had malicious intentions. After confirming this, Lillian's gaze turned colder. After the two of them stared at each other for a few moments, Luoya turned to the huge monster that extended from the cane and ordered, "Spit them out." Following Luoya's order, the mouths of two of the Hydra's heads began to squirm. A few seconds later, the two heads spat out two human-shaped objects mixed with mucus like phlegm. They were Carlo and Luoya, who were swallowed by the Hydra. At that moment, Carlo's clothes were tattered, and he was unconscious on the lawn. His entire body was covered in sticky saliva. But even though he was in a sorry state, there were no obvious wounds on his body. Luoya didn't care about the two half-naked men on the ground. After spitting them out, the Hydra staff began to shrink rapidly under his control. It didn't take long for it to turn back into a simple cane. On the other side, the students of the Academy Security Department, who were responsible for maintaining law and order, rushed over. They surrounded Luoya vigilantly while checking on the condition of the two men. They just fainted. They should be fine. Is that so? Carry them away. The students of the security department heaved a sigh of relief after confirming that the two men were still alive. The atmosphere in the vicinity also relaxed a lot. After the black-haired young man dispelled the rebirth body skill of the Hydra staff, he looked up at the attic again. This time, the hostility in the gaze from above faded slightly. The reason why Luoya took the initiative to let the two idiots go wasn't out of kindness. In fact, he wanted to express to Lillian that he wasn't hostile because the Academy Security Department, who maintained law and order in the square, belonged to Lillian's organization. If one observed carefully, one would notice that every member of the security department had the Purple Rose faction logo on their chest. The degree of student autonomy in St. Freya Academy was quite high, and law and order had always been maintained by the highest-ranked ringbearers and their factions. The head of the Academy Security Department this year was Lillian. To put it bluntly, the entire academy was her territory. Whoever dared to make trouble would be smashing her territory. Unless one wanted to confront her head-on, Luoya had to give in. After the security department determined that the two men were not in danger, Lillian's coercion weakened a lot. The black-haired girl's eyes moved slowly and turned to the Hydra staff in Luoya's hand. An ancient curse item? Lillian's purple pupils contracted slightly. The aura of the Hydra staff just made her feel a slight threat. For a curse item, it was rare for her to be vigilant. Chapter 242. Looking at the refreshed values in the system, Luoya couldn't help but look around. Sure enough, he found that many people in the crowd were green. Obviously, the first large favorability value was from Paul, who he directly helped, and the rest of the small amounts were from the nearby students. Looking at the favorability value, Luoya couldn't help but sigh that there were still many good people in the world. Thinking of this, the young boy's mood improved a little, and he looked at Paul with a faint smile. It's nothing. I just don't like to see the strong bullying the weak. Brother Luoya. No, I should be younger than you. Luoya smiled helplessly and waved his hand. Under the gaze of the crowd, he helped Paul up. The bullied boy looked up with a touched face, but when he saw the scene behind Luoya, he was stunned. At the same time, a familiar voice sounded in Luoya's ears. Indeed, I don't like it either, but you're making too much noise. Huh. A helpless yet doting sigh echoed in his ears, causing the black-haired youth to blink his eyes and turn his head, just in time to see a golden figure strolling over from the separated crowd. Nuwa Ire Heathcliff slowly approached under the encirclement of the nobles. Unlike the last time on the street, Luoya was calmer this time. Luoya had just liberated the Hydra. After such an obvious disturbance, Nuwa Ire was bound to appear. Because Luoya belonged to the theocracy of St. Mestre, strictly speaking, he was under her jurisdiction. This year, because of Nuwa Ire's enrollment, the nobles of the theocracy of St. Mestre who could afford to pay for the tuition fee would pay for Heathcliff's tuition fee. The number of new students far exceeded that of previous years, and their task was naturally to protect Her Royal Highness, although Her Royal Highness didn't need protection at all. As the only son of the Akate family, Luoya's status in the theocracy of St. Mestre was still very high. Coupled with his personal relationship and scandals with Nuwa Ire since childhood, Luoya could be said to be second only to the theocracy's nobles, so to a certain extent, his actions represented the theocracy. The noise nearby became louder after Nuwa Ire walked over. Nuwa Ire's beauty and holiness were like a bright light in the dark, and the grace of a ruler was even more impressive. The students who didn't know the girl's identity whispered to each other, and the new students in the distance were also attracted by the appearance of Hydra, and people kept running over to watch the show. Nuwa Ire's eyes swept across the crowd, and at a glance, he found several girls who were staring at Luoya with strange gazes. Obviously, Luoya's performance of punishing evil and promoting good attracted the attention of many people, many of whom were sympathetic and opposed to school violence. TSK, such a situation really happened. Nuwa Ire was speechless, but still maintained a smile on his face. Under everyone's gaze, Miss Angel walked to the boy's side and affectionately pulled his tie, while her other hand pinched his cheek. Nuwa Iyer? You didn't come with me, and you didn't even look for me after coming here. This is your punishment, you rebellious minister. A somewhat angry and cute voice came from his ear, making Luoya, who was being pinched, stunned. Many people nearby and Paul behind Luoya were also stunned. Wait, why is this plot a bit familiar? Paul, who was shocked by Nuwa Iyer's charm, was stuffed with dog food before he could react. He immediately recalled the scene of Xiaoluot, and his expression immediately became strange, but after looking at Luoya in front of him, he was relieved. Indeed, such a girl can only be matched by an upright and powerful person like Luoya. What a good person. Paul recalled what Luoya had done before, and his heart was moved again. On the other side, Nuwa Iyer was secretly observing the effect of this dog food attack, and she found that many girls were retreating, especially after hearing about Nuwa Iyer's identity. In this world, not many people dared to snatch a man from the future queen of St. Maester, not to mention that Nuwa Iyer's appearance was so outstanding, and the sense of holiness that belonged to the angel bloodline was something that others couldn't replicate. Of course, there were still people who were unwilling to give up. Nuwa Iyer understood this very well. After all, she knew how fragrant Luoya was. As for those who stared at her in the crowd, they were directly ignored by her. It's not that I don't want to look for you. It's just that, I met a new friend. A new friend? After listening to Luoya's explanation, the blonde girl's blue eyes turned and glanced at the boy behind Luoya. Suddenly, she remembered that when Paul was being targeted, Nuwa Iyer once saw Luoya looking at her in the crowd. I say, you didn't do it on my behalf, right? You can say that. Is that so? Chapter 243. When the Princess of St. Maester's kiss landed on Luoya's face, it was as if the air in this corner of the great hall had stopped. Luoya felt the warmth on his face, and his brain turned white. His brain temperature began to rise rapidly. He never thought that Nuwa Iyer would do such a thing in front of so many people. Although the Princess of St. Maester was very open with Luoya in private, on the surface, she had always been a gentle and steady representative. In the 5 years since they met, Nuwa Iyer had never exposed their intimate relationship in public. After all, as the successor of a large country, it wasn't a good thing to expose one's love too obviously. But today, perhaps because she felt threatened by the surrounding people, Miss Angel's aggressive behavior was far more aggressive than before. However, what Luoya didn't know was that the Princess of St. Maester's reward wasn't limited to this. While Luoya's face was burning, Nuwa Iyer's blue eyes slightly narrowed. In the next moment, a moist feeling suddenly appeared in Luoya's mind. The black-haired youth's body suddenly trembled, and the girl took advantage of the situation to stand up and separate from him. With a smile on her face, she began to observe Luoya's reaction. Nuwa Iyer. You. At the end of the light kiss, the young man who was licked by the tip of the tongue covered his face and his face instantly turned red. After the light kiss ended, the surroundings became noisy. The gossipy crowd discussed animatedly. The young men who fell in love and fell out of love in less than a minute beat their chests and stomped their feet. The young ladies who glanced at the black-haired young man quietly gnashed their teeth. Only Luoya, in this chaos, felt dizzy from the heat. He used his hand to wipe away the imperceptible moist stain. He wanted to open his mouth to protest against Miss Angel's nonsense, but under the watchful eyes of the crowd, he couldn't say anything. He could only stutter with a red face and trembling lips. The pleasure of having an affair in front of so many people made the two's hearts restless. Nuwa Iyer looked at the red-faced youth, and the desire in her heart suddenly exploded. That's enough. What if someone finds out? In the eyes of outsiders, the two of them were whispering sweet nothings. In fact, the content was far more explosive than people imagined. Unfortunately, that was the end of it. What are you two doing here? Amidst the commotion, the crowd separated once again. Xiaoluot, who was on the other side of the lawn square, finally arrived. As soon as she entered, she immediately noticed that the atmosphere was not right. After hearing what Nuwa had done, her expression immediately changed. Princess Nuwa, what did you do to my fiancé? Isn't this Miss Xiaoluot? Long time no see. What did you just say? Fiancé? Who is that? Of course it's Luoya. Do you even need to ask? Hehe, Miss Xiaoluo might have remembered wrongly. Luoya is not anyone's fiancé. Oh, I remember now. Your so-called fiancé. Could it be that Luoya has a 100-year marriage contract that has no legal effect on you? Under the watchful eyes of the crowd, the conflict between the two girls erupted. The 5-month gap had made Charlotte angry for a long time, and Noelle, whose good mood had been disturbed, also held a grudge in her heart. The two of them had a war of words, neither giving way to the other. The onlookers were dumbfounded and excited at the same time. On the distant rooftop, the white-bearded old man with a long staff looked over and smiled knowingly. What a group of energetic children. Dean Antonio stroked his beard and sighed. Behind him was a group of teaching staff in uniform. However, unlike Antonio, who had a gratified look on his face, the teaching staff were not as relaxed. Rather, they were under a lot of pressure. The teaching staff witnessed the commotion, but none of them could intervene because St. Freya Academy was a student autonomous academy. Unless it was an emergency, the teaching staff couldn't easily intervene in student affairs, especially when Lillian was present. There was no need to intervene at all. There were not many high-level extraordinaires even among the teachers, and Lillian's level 3 source had a different meaning. The feeling just now, Her Royal Highness' strength has probably surpassed the concept of level 3 source. Yes, but as the preceptor of the Management Academy, this is also a good thing, isn't it? Yes, but thinking about it this way, the student she suppressed is not simple either. To be able to resist such a strong pressure, the teachers behind Antonio began to discuss the incident just now. Many teachers looked at Luo Yu's Hydra staff and began to raise questions to the dean. Dean, isn't that student staff too dangerous? If it goes out of control, indeed, that should be an ancient curse vessel. The teachers were talking about the origin of Roja's cane and worried about the possibility of losing control, but Antonio didn't care about it. Out of control? No, his control is very mature. The monster's behavior seems fierce, but in fact, it is all under his control. The proof is that after such a commotion, no innocent people were hurt at all. The old man looked at the boy in the crowd with a smile, then turned to look at the teachers behind him. Hehe, and when it comes to danger, many experimental projects in this city are far more dangerous. Instead of paying attention to a student's curse vessel, it is better to work hard to control the experimental accident. Otherwise, if our Purple Rose really convenes a council to vote on who to expel, there is nothing I can do. Antonio's warning joke made many people's eyes flicker, and it also stopped some people from studying the Hydra staff. After warning the overly curious people, the old man's gaze returned to the square. At this time, the elders of the school would suddenly become the head of the Human Resources Department. Just like animals entering the mating season, they would also enter the most intimate time of the year. During the opening ceremony and graduation ceremony, the representatives of each sect were all smiles, trying their best to leave the best impression on the students. Of course, flying lanterns and banners were also needed. There were also plenty of loudspeakers and people standing on the streets to snatch people. Their only goal was to get as many people as they could. After all, if they had fewer people, their opponents might have more. Luoya looked at the sect representative on the stage and ridiculed him in his heart, but he didn't dare to say a word. At this time, the black-haired youth's face was serious, his body was straight, and his eyes were straight. He looked like a good student who was seriously listening to the person on stage. As a person who had been a student for most of his life in his previous life, Luoya naturally wasn't really interested in the entrance ceremony. The reason why he was so good now was mainly because the situation forced him to. At this time, The black-haired youth was sitting in the middle of a long row of seats. On his left was Nuwa Iyer Heathcliff and a group of officials and attendants. On his right was Sialuot Serofia and a large number of attendants. The two groups of people each occupied one side. From the moment they entered the auditorium, the blonde girl and the reddish-brown girl refused to budge an inch. They were fighting fiercely for Luo Yu's seat. Seeing this, the black-haired youth suddenly had an idea. He suddenly remembered his good friend Mr. Paul. But when he turned around, he saw that Mr. Paul had followed the crowd and left with an encouraging smile. "Brother Luoya, you can do it." Vaguely, Luoya seemed to have heard Paul's inner voice. Obviously, after Paul learned about Nuwa Iyer's identity and saw Sialuot rushing over, he felt that it was very awkward for him to be here. So, he silently left by himself. But he probably didn't know that it was actually when Luoya needed him the most. "Fuck. Why did you run away?" Looking at the youth disappearing into the crowd, Luoya gritted his teeth. After the Paul shield was gone, he had to face the firepower of the two girls. After some bargaining, the two sides could only compromise, and the final result was this situation. In the middle, Luoya's face was calm, but his heart was trembling. Especially towards the blonde girl, Luoya's guard was quite deep. The Nuwa Iyer seemed to like that kind of stimulation, especially his frightened appearance, which made the Nuwa Iyer's face turn red. Of course, Sialuot on the other side also couldn't be underestimated. From a certain point of view, there was nothing that she didn't dare to do. After all, there was nothing more outrageous than kidnapping. Moreover, from the perspective of the Academy, Sialuot's family was the #1 financial backer. If the Big Miss committed a crime, the Academy would be overestimating her ability to turn a blind eye. In this crisis, Luoya didn't even dare to put his hands on the armrest. He sat upright and still throughout the whole process. But what surprised him was that the two girls seemed to be concerned about the nearby population density and influence. They actually restrained themselves and didn't do anything out of line. As time passed, the black-haired youth felt a little relieved. He turned his attention back to the opening ceremony. After a large group of school representatives went through the motions, the main point of the opening ceremony finally arrived. With the sound of a wooden stick hitting the ground, a tall old man wearing a luxurious robe walked onto the stage. The moment he appeared, Luoya clearly felt the atmosphere in the auditorium change. The whispering students stopped making noise, and the teenagers who weren't sitting properly also straightened up. Almost everyone in the auditorium subconsciously began to adjust their state of mind to make their expressions and attitudes more in line with the etiquette. Antonio, the headmaster of St. Freya Academy, was a name that was widely known in Shia and even in the Kingdom of Scholars. There were two main reasons for this. The first was naturally his strength. No one knew exactly how strong he was because he hadn't fought for many years, but it was certain that he was one of the top combatants in the human world in Shia. The second reason was that he had lived for a long time. If Luoya remembered correctly, this white-bearded old man should be around 400 years old this year, which was quite old among the existing extraordinaires. Although an extraordinaire's lifespan would continue to increase as their bodies mutated, in fact, the increase in lifespan of low-level extraordinaires was limited. High-level extraordinaires, on the other hand, had to shoulder a lot of social responsibilities, especially in the past few hundred years when the human world was in turmoil. Many high-level extraordinaires had died on the battlefield of the mutants' westward invasion. In a war, the most important thing was money and manpower. As the largest training base for human talents, the Kingdom of Scholars naturally couldn't afford to lose. Although there were many extraordinaires in each school, the proportion of those who could actually fight on the battlefield was not high. Therefore, after several wars, the Kingdom of Scholars had the most surviving extraordinaires. As a human powerhouse, Antonio had also fought on the battlefield during the last racial war and achieved very good results. However, as the saying went, there were internal and external troubles. Every time there was chaos, the shortcomings of the Kingdom of Scholars would be exposed. There would always be some people who would jump out and cause trouble. Antonio had no choice but to lead people to pacify the internal situation and stabilize the foundation. This way, his position would naturally be less dangerous. As one grew older, one's seniority would be higher. However, as the Speaker of the Kingdom of Scholars, although old, Antonio was very close to the people. For many years, his support among the people had been very high. During his tenure as the headmaster of the academy, he had repeatedly encouraged the students to strengthen their autonomy and advocated for de-dogmatism. Therefore, he was also very popular among the students. With such a figure on the stage, the students below would more or less cooperate with him. Under the attention of the crowd, Antonio, the headmaster of the academy, began his speech. However, the theme of Antonio's speech was unexpectedly not some chicken blood injection. Instead, it was a little heavy. The responsibility of growth. This was the theme of Antonio's speech. Dear students, the moment you stepped into this auditorium, it means that you have become the pride of the world, ahead of most of your peers in the human world. In the next few years, the gap between you and the outside world will only grow bigger and bigger. You can cheer and be proud, but don't forget one thing. When you are at the top of the human race, the pressure that the race shares on you will become sharper and heavier. As students of St. Freya Academy, I hope that you will not only grow in strength, but also in your sense of responsibility. The source substance gives us strength and lets us know which direction to work towards. However, since ancient times, there have been an endless number of fallen people. Why are there so many people who have gone astray in the same direction? Because they often pursue their own interests. When they take risks out of desperation, they forget about their family, forget about their country, and forget about the human situation. When responsibility is covered in dust, indulgence blinds their minds and leads them to destruction. Listening to Antonio's speech, the young man's expression gradually became serious. To be honest, Luoya felt that this speech was more suitable for graduation. After all, most of these new students had just stepped out of their comfort zone. In many of their eyes, the world was still bright and beautiful. Not to mention fallen people and evil cultists, these young masters and young ladies had probably not even seen a criminal before. Not everyone was like Luoya, who was watched by evil cultists from a young age and constantly moved forward through trials of life and death. In the end, these words were still a little too early for most people at this age. However, as an educator, Antonio should be very clear about these things. So why did he still say it? The deeper meaning behind it, Luoya's golden pupils slightly narrowed as he silently pondered. Chapter 245. Based on the current situation, the Shia country that Luoya was in was relatively peaceful. Although the situation between the small countries changed from time to time, the relationship between the big countries was still stable. Therefore, in this era, the freshman who had just reached adulthood had not seen much bloodshed. In fact, if it weren't for his bloodline, Luoya himself wouldn't have seen any war. This showed the importance of the bloodline of the Akhat family. Awakening and not awakening were two completely different paths, and the endpoint was probably as different as heaven and earth. In this aspect, the Hefket family was better. Thinking of this, Luoya couldn't help but sigh. Nuwa Ayer's strength was reasonable. After all, not all the royal families dared to send their heirs to the front line, let alone really fight the monsters. According to Luoya's guess, in the years after the problems on the Eastern Front, Nuwa Ayer should have more combat experience than him, or at least more combat experience than him. On the other hand, Luoya's advantage was the kind of battles that hovered between life and death. One focused on quantity, while the other focused on quality. It could only be said that each had its own advantages. As for setting his sights on the human race and assuming his own responsibilities, if he didn't know about the existence of the 6 disasters, perhaps Luoya wouldn't have thought about it. It could only be said that different experiences led to different perceptions. Although Dean Antonio's words were profound, they didn't feel real to the freshman present. The old man must have a purpose for saying these things in advance, and it wasn't difficult for Luoya to guess the purpose. It was probably to prepare for the war with the aliens. But if that's the case, does it mean that Dean Antonio is not optimistic about the situation on the front line? Does he know something that others don't? Or is he just saying it as a precaution? A deeper layer of thinking made Luoya frown. While the teenager was thinking, the white-haired old man also finished his speech and walked off the stage in the warmest applause of the audience. The dean's words seemed to have a deeper meaning. Nuair, who had been on the front lines for quite some time, noticed something different. On the other side, Xia Luot, who had witnessed the 6 calamities, together with Luoya, had a complicated expression on her face. Indeed, but most of the people here don't understand. It was rare for the reddish-brown-haired girl to agree with her love rival. Her emerald eyes swept across the entire place, and she couldn't help but smile bitterly when she saw the brilliant smiles on the freshmen's faces. Luoya listened to the words of the two girls and didn't say anything. As time passed, the applause gradually subsided and a new figure walked onto the stage. The moment she appeared, the audience fell into complete silence. Looking at the girl under the spotlight in front of her, the blonde angel's expression was cold, and her blue eyes were alert and vigilant. The previous confrontation between Lillian and Luoya in the square made Nuair feel uneasy. On the other side, although the brown-haired elf lady did not catch the confrontation scene, because of the national enmity, she did not have a good impression of the Austin royalty. Perhaps the atmosphere here was too different from the surroundings. During the speech, Lillian's eyes stopped here more than once. When she saw Luoya's seat, she couldn't help but squint slightly. Normally, as a subordinate of Nuair, Luoya should sit on the left side of Nuair, but now he was sandwiched between Nuair and Xiaoluot. This position had already explained many things. It seemed that the information was wrong. In this situation, instead of saying that he was two-timing, it was better to say that he was being fought over. Lillian's purple eyes swept over the situation on Luoya's side, but then a question arose in her heart. Why did this happen? Normally, even if the heirs of two countries fell in love with the same person, they wouldn't fight so openly. Was it a dispute of personal feelings? Or did the Akhat family have something that they must obtain? Lillian, who had never experienced such intense feelings, couldn't understand the two girls. However, this did not affect her judgment of Luoya's power. Judging from the current situation, he actually had the support of both the theocracy and Luokair, which was rare even in the hundreds of years of St. Freya Academy's history. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.